So, before we go on to questions, which we're about to do, could you please, when you ask a question, name and use the microphone. Just before that, I just want to remind you at the ends of the table, Amandeep, who looks after the Erasmus programme and also Europe Direct, and Craig at the other end here, who looks after the Enterprise Europe Network. For my sins, I do Europaid, but yeah, we want to talk about that, won't we? Okay, I'd like to throw the floor open to you, please. Nigel.
Nigel Jones. Right, Nigel Jones, Newcastle on the line. Two questions really. One, perhaps more of an internal question. Our local party, for several years now, including the previous EU election period, takes the attitude that combining a campaign for the EU together with local council elections is not on. Let's forget the EU. There are too many people in our locality who are so turned off and don't want anything to do with the EU issues that if we were to combine in our leaflet something about that with our local election campaign, we would lose. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, though it may be partly to do with my second question, which is based on the fact that so many people, even politicians in our own party, who don't have a full understanding of the true issues with regard to the EU. And this has come out of what I've been hearing just from that speech, which was marvellous. If I could ask therefore one detailed question on that, could we have just a little bit of explanation as to how it's come about that free movement of people is just as fundamental a part of the single market as free movement of goods and services?
Thank you. Two questions. I'll deal with those immediately, then we'll come on to Neville. Phil, if you care to take the first one, and Jackie perhaps the second.
Yes, Nigel. But in terms of integrated campaigning, all the figures show that it works best. If we got Ryan Curtsey here to talk to you now, he would leave you totally convinced that what we are, what the Liberal Democrats are, if anything, is a brand. Now, an unnamed MP yesterday morning thought that he would possibly do better by disassociating himself from what we do at European level and at Westminster level, just to simply say, I'm your local MP. And Ryan's answer to this was, how many of you in this room, because all our MPs were, virtually all our MPs were there, how many of you are convinced that if you stood as independents in 2015, you would get re-elected? And the answer is none. So basically, it is that core image of who the Liberal Democrats are that deliver the largest proportion of your vote. Yes, the personal vote goes along with it, but this means that the more we develop that clear view of what we are, the higher that level of vote that comes with the tag of being a Liberal Democrat, the higher that develops. So what you do by disassociating all of these different parts of the campaign is you leave your base level Liberal Democrat vote at the lowest level in perpetuity. You can only raise that by integrating your campaigning. So it might be a long-term run, but you've got to do it. Otherwise you are stuck where you are forever, and you will never ever get any growth. So that's the reasoning behind it, but the evidence shows that it works as well. All the empirical evidence shows that integrating campaigning is the best way.
Thank you. That was fairly definite, I think.
Fairly definite.
Thank you. Well, if you go back to the very foundation of the European Economic Community. So you go back to before British accession, you go back to before the last referendum. Free movement of persons was a fundamental principle. So this is not something that has been bolted on recently. Why? Because in economic theory, you look at the factors of production. To make goods or to provide services, you need the raw materials, you need finance, hence free movement of capital, and you need people, either to produce the goods or to provide the services. So the idea was that you free up all of the factors of production and they move around to the areas where goods can be produced or services can be provided most efficiently. It wasn't seen at the inception of the European community as a fundamental civil right to move between member states. It was seen as a way of making the European economy more efficient by moving people to areas where labour was needed. And if you look back to the 40s, the 50s, the early 60s, you see there were big migrations of people from the south of Europe to Germany, to the coal and steel works in Belgium and in Luxembourg. So it was purely economic to begin with. And if you look at today and tomorrow, that is also now increasingly the case. So whereas the last 10 years have been marked by east to west migration, people moving from Eastern and Central Europe to the United Kingdom, to the Netherlands, to France to some extent. What is now happening is you're getting south to north migration again. So people who can't find a job, horrifyingly can't find a job, in Spain, Italy, Greece, are now going to where there are big skill shortages, essentially in Germany. So you're seeing different patterns of migration, and it's reverting, if you like, to the old economic arguments. And one of the things you can also do is compare the European Union to the United States. We have terribly low levels of overall mobility of labour compared to the US, and it's a handicap in terms of our economic development and productivity. I would also say, and I'll be honest, that the conception of the free movement has changed over the years. It's much more seen now as an individual right, part of your right as a European citizen to go and live wherever you want in the European Union. And that's why now, for example, retired people have a right to go and reside in another member state. Why, if you are not earning, but you have independent means, you can still go and live in another member state. That would not have been the case back in 1957, because you were not productive. So the concept has evolved over time, but the core economic arguments, I think, remain good.
Thank you. I think Phil just wants to add something.
Yeah, very, very quickly. UK businesses, when we talk to them, are entirely opposed to the immigration cap. And they understand that the Liberal Democrats haven't pushed this into government as well. It's coming from the Conservative Party. And business is totally opposed to it. They're very outspoken about it. And the other thing about the civil right, we are starting to see it more as a civil right, particularly retired people who live in Spain, southern France. And if we were to leave the EU and lose those rights, a lot of British people would be very, very upset that rights they'd come to accept and take for granted would be taken away from them.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to now, we've got a number of people. Neville, gentleman there, and finally Lee. So Neville, if you'd start.
Neville Farmer from Wyre Forest. Partly a point of view first, followed by a request. Phil gave figures as to the current polling on the EU, which is roughly 50-50. It's shifted around that point for some time. Frankly, as a Liberal Democrat, I would be ecstatic to get that much of the vote. And if we're the only party that is in support of the EU and we can get somewhere near that amount of the vote, then we will do better than 11 MEPs at the next election. It is a worry for councillors because they think, well, I'm not particularly pro-EU, and I understand where Nigel's point came from. but actually on balance, the one thing that we can stand up for, that a very large percentage of people in this country are in favour of, is that we support the European project because we know it's good for us. The request on the back of that is that the ambassador has given us a number of sort of statistics, and there are a lot of statistics bandied around that have recently been poo-pooed, including the 3.5 million jobs relying on the EU, which a number of papers have been trying to debunk. It would be really useful to have a list of very positive, localised statistics about the number of jobs that genuinely come as a result of the EU to the West Midlands, both industrial jobs and rural jobs, and what it means to the economy of the West Midlands for our campaign next year.
Thank you. Okay.
Martin Lewis from Stoke. Martin Lewis from Stoke. How do you see the EU developing whilst the Eurozone is sorting itself out? Are we really heading for a two-speed Europe?
Thank you, Martin. And Lee?
Hi, Lee, Doug. One thing that actually unites the Eurosceptic and the Europhile and the Tories and UKIP is the idea that centrally, or at the top of the hierarchy, there is little or no democracy in the institution that is the EU. If we accept that as a premise, what is the problem and how do we solve it?
Thank you very much indeed. Starting with the question from Neville regarding local and regional information statistically on jobs created rurally and urbanly. Have you any ideas there? Or is this something that we could do through the Europe Directs and other organisations? I thought I'd get everyone in the conversation.
Well, these type of figures I don't really have off the top of my head. I will go back to the office and I will contact you if I do have the figures. If not, I will find them.
Jackie, is there any way you can look?
So just a couple of things. We do a blog from Europe House in London, some of which is useful statistics, not broken down regionally. But for example, it has a lot of the statistical findings on migration in there. So, contribution against the cost of migration. The second thing is we always try and use, wherever possible, we try and use British national statistics or British government statistics in our arguments, rather than using Commission statistics. When I say we there, I mean we in London, because it's much easier to say the British government itself says. And there is a lot in the House of Commons library. So we take a lot from the House of Commons library, from papers which are put down there, for example, by the Minister for Europe. So the data is there, but you have to do some digging for it. But I take away the suggestion and we see what you can do. The other thing, if you're looking particularly at your region, there is on the Europa website, that's the Central Commission website, there's something called a financial transparency database. So you can, for example, put in the name of your local university, wherever that is, and see how much it's obtained in European funding. And that might be a useful way of doing it. Or your region or your local development partnership. You can just put it, or you can search even on the name of a city and find out who in that city has received funding from one or the other European source.
Thank you very much. Could you do the...
Yes, Martin's on one. I've just got one sentence for Neville first, and that is whatever empirical means you try to make this estimate from, it will be an estimate. And but not only will it be an estimate, it will almost inevitably be an underestimate. And this goes back to what I was saying in my initial address about inward investment. Inward investment is something that occurs over decades. and the jobs that are provided by inward investment over decades would not all disappear immediately, but in 3 decades outside of the single market, it's clear that jobs would go that would fall outside of the empirical analyses, because and as a result the whole economy would fail to grow, it would stagnate, and so 20, 30 years down the line you could be talking about several million jobs, but also you could be talking about the average job value being lower too. So, and that job value of those jobs spins off other jobs in the service sector. So it's extremely difficult to come to a figure. But whatever figure you come to by empirical means, it will almost certainly be an underestimate. And Martin, not to two-speed Europe, we're already, I think, moving towards variable geometry, what I call variable geometry. Now, even Francois Hollande, who I'm not a great fan of, was fairly relaxed about developing variable geometry. When, for instance, the UK and its allies were talking about maybe having more opt-ins and opt-outs on employment law, for instance, if we wanted them, or if there was a group of member states that actually felt they wanted to go down that route. We already have, as you say, the Eurozone and those who are not in. We also have some pre-ins. We have countries with different arrangements about when or whether they're going to use the euro. In terms of that, there will be, I think, a variable speed until the banking union starts to actually take effect and we get bank recapitalisation and therefore more stability into the Eurozone, so the Eurozone can start growing more uniformly again. I mean, Germany's still growing, but the rest of it isn't. Then we've also got the Schengen zone. We've got, we're not in it, the Irish are not in it, I think it's Romania and Bulgaria aren't in it, but nearly everybody else is. There are some non-EU states that are in it. So I think there is a growing feeling of relaxation about this variable geometry, which is not necessarily to speed, but with a lot. I think it's a product of enlargement. It's a product of enlargement that inevitably we have to do things a little bit more flexibly, and we see the like-minded group that Britain's part of, which is a group of economically liberal member states, which again answers the question about having allies, which Jackie pointed out earlier. The like-minded group has a blocking minority. If Britain and its allies don't want something new to be brought in, then it can be stopped by groups within the council. So I think that we have this variable geometry. I think it will evolve further in this way. I don't think it'll be two-speed, I think it'll be multi-speed, but overall I think that will be actually a healthy way to go forward.
Thank you. On to Lee's question. I'm sorry. No, we haven't done these. We're about to come to you to do Lee's now. I was just, no, not at all. I was just thinking that if we had a little test to do as to the European Union and what institutions are in it and which ones are out, I wonder who would get them right. But Jackie, if you could just address Lee's question.
Sorry. First of all, I absolutely agree with what Phil has just said about variable geometry. Different people describe it in different ways. They talk about concentric circles or overlapping circles. And again, there is some concern, particularly in the City of London, that with banking union and the Eurozone ins and the Eurozone outs, there'll be caucusing, that people will form blocks to the disadvantage of the UK. I think there is a certain risk of that, but I think it's a very limited risk because there's a lot of fluidity in terms of alliances. There are a group of economically liberal, free trading nations that generally stick together, but on other things there can be some strange alliances. So I think that may be a long-term concern, as one group of countries becomes very interlocked inevitably they're going to be more inclined to think in the same way. But in the medium term, that's not too much of a worry. Democratic accountability. I think this is a problem. I agree that it's a difficulty. And there are two ways it can be addressed. One is by, and this is Phil's job, to make people more aware of the degree to which the European Parliament, which is, after all, democratically elected, the degree to which it holds to account the Commission, but also the Council. Effectively, what we have now in Europe is a bicameral, a two-chamber legislature. The Parliament is one chamber, the Council of Ministers is the other. And I would say, on balance, the Parliament is more akin to the House of Commons. That's where most of the agreements are found these days. It can't steamroller the Council, but it has at least as much leverage, influence, power as the Council. So that's one answer. The other answer, which is being peddled by the Foreign Secretary and the Minister for Europe, is to give national parliaments a lot more power to hold the Commission and the European Union more generally to account. I'm not quite sure exactly how their ideas would work, this idea of more yellow cards, red cards, whatever colour cards. Where I do think William Hague is right is in saying that the scrutiny function in the Houses of Parliament here in the United Kingdom could be improved. More could be done by parliamentary select committees to look at legislation or to look at proposals even before they've formally been tabled, and to get in early in terms of influencing them. A lobbyist said to me recently, if you're having to lobby to get amendments to the Commission's proposal in Parliament, you've failed. Because where you should be getting in is before the proposal is made. And that's obviously a lobbyist speaking for a particular commercial interest. But it's the same is true for a national interest. What Parliament needs to be doing is making sure that it knows what's on the agenda, which is what is coming along, and getting in early and making clear that this is examined, British views are taken into account. I think it is happening more and more. I go quite regularly with colleagues from Brussels to parliamentary select committees to give evidence. So it is happening more and more, but it's still probably not enough.
Just take one line on this.
Lee, we have a parliament. It's the European Parliament. We're an elected parliament, and everything goes through the parliament now. Since the Lisbon Treaty, we don't have a situation where we have co-decision on almost everything. There are still some democratic deficits, and the one that concerns me most is social partner agreements, where big business and big trade unions can make agreements which have legal force and can only be blocked by a veto of one of the member states and don't even come to the Parliament for an opinion. And to my mind, they're a democratic. It's not just a failure. It's a travesty, and that's one thing I'd love to change. But it's been there since the year dot, and whether we can change it or not, I don't know, but we'll try.
You have an MEP on a mission there, by the sounds of it. More questions. David, I know, has raised his hand. Are there any other questions that we can take? Ben's got a question as well, and Simon over there. So let's start, please, with David.
Thank you, Murray, from Wrekin and Tel. Presumably, a lot of companies from outside the single market invest in the UK did so because of access to the single market itself. And if you were to pull out of the UK, out of the single market, out of the EU, then presumably these companies would migrate to the continent. And large companies like Toyota, Nissan, and other people in this country would get benefit of actually access to the European market.
you. Okay, so that's FDI and staying in the UK. Ben?
I'm just interested in some of the wider questions that have come out of the European debate in the last few months. In terms of the obviously speakers on the panel, the Europe Direct and the Erasmus programme, is the interest in your work affected in any way by the way political debate in Britain has changed in the last few months or the last year? Perhaps Jonathan can go through on this or anything like that. Because the way that the union is perceived or characterised in the media is one thing, yet we hear that Erasmus and Europe Direct continue to be very successful in what they do and to deliver benefits. So there's a disconnect in the media narrative of what goes on and what is going on the ground.
We'll have a go at that between us. And Simon?
Simon Oliver from Redditch. Are there any statistics available about the influence that free movement has had on the amount of aid that the new entries to EU have received? For example, if Polish people come over here to work, they send a lot of money home. Has that reduced the amount of money that Poland needs from the EU directly?
Well, repatriation of funds from migrant workers. Okay, fine. David, I think any three of us could answer that, but I'm going to give it to Phil, I think, on the FDI.
Well, David, you've just largely repeated what a lot of what I said in my opening address. In that, as you've actually just repeated what I've said, I can't say anything other than I totally agree with you. And as I said, I've even spoken to the American Chamber of Commerce directly on this. I've spoken to investors, potential investors from other parts of the world. No, I haven't spoken to the Japanese, but yeah, I mean they're obvious candidates, Honda and Toyota, both outside of this constituency, but both close enough to it to have workers who commute to those factories. Telford? Oh no, I said Honda and Toyota. I said Honda and Toyota. So yes, and the clear message even from those potential investors is that they're already having. I think investment in the UK slowed up in the last 12 months. I think because of the risk of the referendum. Companies are holding fire to see what we do, because if we do look like we're going to leave, they'll divert that investment elsewhere. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence from everybody I speak to in industry, whether they're internal or external, think this is true. I've come across nobody yet that counters what you've said. Thank you.
Just on the Japanese, I did a round table in the city with 30 Japanese banks, investment insurance companies, and being Japanese, they were very discreet. But what was said to me beforehand in the kind of briefing prior to the round table was that it has already affected Japanese investment Japanese appetite for investment in the United Kingdom. That the Japanese, in particular, do dislike uncertainty, and the prospect of a referendum. We might have a referendum, we might not. We don't know what the outcome will be if we have a referendum, is already acting as a disincentive to further investment in the UK.
Ben, to sort of address your question, a few weeks ago it was Europe Day, and at the Chamber of Commerce we held this Europe Fair at which your colleagues from your office were present, and we had Erasmus, Europe Direct, ERES, which is a sort of a European employment there's a number of European institutions present, and we had about 50 people turn up, and we had that fabulous European institution called UKIP arrive and asked whether they could put the alternative view of Europe. And we said yes, because it's a democratic, and so we should. What was fascinating, absolutely fascinating, with the combination of the EEN, with all these things I've mentioned, is that UKIP lasted about a quarter of an hour. Very polite, well dressed, thuggish in their own unique way, and left. And the reason they left was it was quite impossible to counter what was the stuff that was on offer. We had, I mean, mainly young people were there looking at the Erasmus opportunities, how they could find movement, how they could get business opportunities and so on. And I found it almost a revelation that the amount of opportunity that's available to us is there, but we simply don't know it. And it always strikes me that one travels in Europe and you see the blue plaques, you see open, overt statements that this project was funded in collaboration with, in conjunction with the European Union. I know they do exist in the UK, and we've got a couple in our building, but they're rare. It's not often you see it. I occasionally fly the European flag on our flagpole at work. And it's such an occurrence, people ring me up and say, gosh, Jonathan, what's going on? You're flying a European flag. And you're, yeah, what the hell, you know, we're European. It's Europe Day. So, knowing that we've got about a minute and a half left, there is a move, there is a change. I work very, very deeply embedded with the business community in the West Midlands, especially in Birmingham, both in manufacturing and in services. It is a motif that runs through almost every intelligent conversation now, is for goodness sake, you've got to make sure that we remain in Europe, because it isn't just the numbers, the figures, the bottom line that counts. It's the skills and the opportunity and the FDI that we've been talking about, the culture, the language, all the things that make up an identity are homogenous. And it is a foolish notion, frankly, to think that suddenly, in the 21st century, in a world of blocks, we are going to go and stand alone. We may as well go and live on Rockall. But there we are. The final question, Simon. Stats on the value of repatriated funds from migrant workers?
And by the way, in terms of retired people moving abroad.
I think it's a very interesting question, and I thank you for having asked it. But to be honest, I don't know the answer. I do know, what I know is that entitlement to regional funding, to structural funding, is based on GDP levels locally. So it probably doesn't capture remittances, or it would only capture them indirectly, in that if money is sent back and then invested in local businesses, that would push up GDP eventually. And I don't even know if there's any work being done on the value of money sent back. I will go away and find out, and I will tell Jonathan if I find an answer.
Thank you.
Well, very gently then, I have to bring this to a close, because I can see Christine ready to throw something at me. And so, in so doing, I want to thank, first of all, my two colleagues, Ammo and Craig. I'm the boss, so they had to come, but I did say that if you do, you get a day off in lieu. But I've also said you do this for the Tory party, and I'm adding a day. So, yeah. That's the one thing. So, lads, thank you very much indeed. It's much appreciated. And you've got to stand outside. And any questions at all, you will be amazed if you go to ask what is available. It's astounding, absolutely astounding. Phil, thank you very much indeed. It's very, very kind. But Jackie, all the way up from London, pleasant drive on a sunny day. We arranged that for you as well. Audience, thank you. And if you could show your appreciation, it's very kind.